Now that we have actually learned about all of the first wave civilizations from Norte Chico to the Olmec civilization to the Indus River Valley and Mesopotamia and Egypt and also China, I believe it's important to study gender and sexuality in the ancient world. And while you will see some customs that are similar to what we have in the modern day, you will also see many that are significantly different. However, despite the fact that some of these are a bit shocking or a bit lewd, some people would say today, it's important to study them because they tell us a great deal about marriage, about family, about love, about relationships in the ancient world, about the status and the role of men and women, and about the way that societies worked. In all of these first wave civilizations, we see several similarities. The first of these is that patriarchy is in place in every single one. And of course, if you remember, patriarchy is a system of male rule and privilege, and it implies the subjugation of women. You see because of this that men have a lot more control in marriage and in sexuality. We also see, despite many civilizations having very liberal views on sex, that there's an emphasis on procreation, that most of them have some form of polygamy or concubinage, which is very similar, that almost all of them officially condemn homosexuality, but then the attitudes of common people often show acceptance for it, as long as it doesn't disrupt the social system and as long as it's not a powerful man who is being what they would have viewed as effeminate on the receiving end. And we also see that there is a link in almost all of these civilizations to religion or belief systems, that there is some holy aspect to it, and that there's no concept of sexual identity. This idea of labeling someone as homosexual or heterosexual or bisexual simply did not exist until the 19th century, and while those same-sex acts may have existed, you certainly did not define your entire identity based on this. And then the very last similarity that we see in all of these first wave civilizations is that they all lived in very close confines, which meant that people learned sex education by living in a very small household with their parents. And if it was a one-room household, then of course parents were engaging in intercourse with the children nearby. So if we start in Mesopotamia, the picture that you're seeing here is actually a primary source. It was discovered in an archaeological dig near ancient Sumer. And obviously you can see that there is an erotic nature to this particular find. And certainly the archaeologists were surprised when they uncovered this. It looks rather large. However, it was just a little clay tablet that would probably fit into the palm of your hand. Now, what we know about ancient Mesopotamia is that there were very specific gender roles. They were patriarchal, with men in positions of power and women were expected to be submissive, which means that men governed the home as well as the political realm, and also that they did all of the wage-earning work outside of the home. But interestingly, this wasn't the kind of patriarchy that was super oppressive in the form that China would take. Instead, these women were able to own their own land and their own businesses. They were able to buy and sell slaves and even to initiate divorce proceedings. So this means that women in Mesopotamia, despite being treated as inferior to men, actually had a lot more freedom than they would have had in some of these other places that we're going to discuss. Within Mesopotamian society, marriage really had a vital importance to society. It was necessary in order to ensure social stability in the form of nuclear families, but also it was necessary to continue on the family line. Remember that throughout most of history, all the way up into the early modern era, many societies practiced a system of primogeniture, especially patriarchal societies, where husbands and fathers would pass their land down to their eldest son, as well as their name. And so they needed to ensure that they married well and that they married a fertile woman in order to procreate, and that they controlled that woman's sexuality so that they ensured that they passed their name and their land down to their legitimate offspring. And so the way that they actually got married in Mesopotamia is through arranged marriages. And the couple really did not meet until the ceremony. Now, there would be bridal auctions, and the picture up at the top may even remind you a bit of a slave auction, except that the women were able to wear their clothing, and that you've got women from the very upper classes down to the very lowest classes who would be paraded up onto this block and essentially sold to the highest bidder. Now, the husband may see his wife beforehand if he's the one doing the bidding, but quite often the woman would not see her future husband until the very day of her marriage, as she walked down the aisle and had the veil lifted up and, married her husband. I'm not sure if you can imagine a life in which the partner with whom you spend the rest of your days was sort of arbitrarily chosen without any of your consent. So here is actually a primary source quotation from Histories 1 about the Babylonian marriage market to tell you a little bit more about how it worked. Quote, once a year in each village, the young women eligible to marry were collected all together in one place, while the men stood around them in a circle. Then a herald called up the young women one by one and offered them for sale. He began with the most beautiful. When she was sold for a high price, he offered for sale the one who ranked next in beauty. All of them were then sold to be wives. The richest of the Babylonians who wished to wed bid against each other for the loveliest young women, while the commoners, who were not concerned about beauty, received the uglier women along with monetary compensation. All who liked might come, even from distant villages, and bid for the women. This was the best of all their customs, but it has now fallen into disuse. So, based on this primary source, we learn that at these marriage markets, a herald would call up women onto the stage, and they would start with the most exquisitely beautiful woman, and she, of course, would be sold to the highest bidder for a great price. And then as they moved further and further down the ranks, the women were considered less and less attractive. And at that point, these women who were less comely would then have to actually offer monetary compensation to the man in order to be chosen. I can only imagine what this would do for a woman's self-esteem. So within marriage, once they actually tie the knot, love is in fact an important part of marriage, but marriage was still a contract, and that contract was not between husband and wife the way it is in the United States today, but it was a contract between the father and the fiancé. And so the Mesopotamian word for love is actually a compound verb, and it means quite literally to measure the earth or to mark off land. So marriage was a fundamental business arrangement, and it was created to assure an orderly society. And even today, you might argue that marriage in a lot of ways is a contract. And at this point, it's a contract between a husband and wife or two spouses. And of course, also the government is involved in the United States in our marriage contract as well. And in fact, if you know much about American history, Thomas Jefferson was actually the very first American to argue, based on John Locke's theory of the social contract theory, that divorce should be readily available, because if a contract was not in the interest of both people, it should be something that could be dissolved. So in the ancient Mesopotamian society, certainly, despite the fact that it was a business arrangement, there inevitably was an emotional component that grew from living day in and day out with the same person. But the prime intent of it was not companionship, but to procreate and to continue on the lineage of the man, and also to bring stability to society. And so you can see that Mesopotamians put the continuity of their community for the future over their personal happiness, and they often sacrifice their personal happiness for this purpose. Now, having a child was the central feature or purpose of marriage, and if a couple was childless as they were aiming to get pregnant, it was always considered to be the woman's fault, and it was also considered to be a terrible misfortune. So in Mesopotamian society, men could take on a second wife if the first one was infertile, and technically this second wife would take the role of a concubine. If he was able to have children with the concubine, then those children would actually become the children of his first wife, and they would inherit and carry on the family name and inherit the property. Now, husbands were allowed to have as many concubines as they could afford and as they could take care of, but they could not divorce their wives just for being impotent or infertile. And even if she was incredibly sick or unhealthy, they had to continue to honor her. Were she to pass away, then in her death, the first concubine would become first wife, and other successive concubines would move up in the ranks. Divorce in the ancient world, all the way up through most of the modern world, was extremely rare, and there was a great social stigma attached to it. Most people married for life, and they remained married even if they were unhappy and bickered and fought continually. Usually, if there was some kind of divorce proceeding, it was initiated by a husband due to a female who was infertile. However, this would mean that the husband would have to return her dowry, so it was much easier to just get a concubine than to actually lose money by divorcing a wife. The other thing we see is that there is sort of a double standard in Mesopotamia regarding sexuality. Men were able to cheat on their wives and have concubines or have intercourse with another woman as long as she wasn't married. However, if a woman was caught having intercourse with anyone other than her husband, according to Hammurabi's code, her husband could choose to throw her and her lover into the river. And according to the code as well, if her husband decided to show mercy and save her, he had to spare both her and her lover. Now, women really would not be granted a divorce very often, but if they were granted one, it would only be in cases of severe abuse or neglect. And one of the reasons women very seldom asked for a divorce is that if they even expressed the desire, their husband had the right to throw them out of his home, and they might be penniless, and they might even be naked, roaming the streets looking for shelter. So one of the other really interesting facets of sexuality and gender in ancient Mesopotamia is the link to religion. Now, we know that all first wave civilizations were patriarchies, but Mesopotamia actually started out as a matriarchy under the goddess Ishtar. And Ishtar was the deity of life and men, women, other deities, sexual power, pregnancy, birth, and all that was female, as well as warfare. So after Mesopotamia would go into battle, and if they were victorious, there would be a temple full of women who worshipped Ishtar that would celebrate through a feast and sex. And actually, the origin of the word harlot comes from Ishtar's other name. She became known as Har or Hora, and you can probably understand why that will emerge as we talk more about this concept of sacred prostitution. Now, as time starts to move on, Ishtar loses some of her status. This is during the period of the demotion of the goddess, and male gods who are bearing weapons began to surface and take over the pantheon of Mesopotamian gods. Now, Mesopotamians observed the moon's phases very exactly in order to calculate the precise dates for religious observations, and the very most important observation they had each year was a sacred sexual rite of the new year. And on the new year, the king who was ruling would symbolically marry the goddess Ishtar amidst feasting and celebration. And this happened for thousands of years. Now, he would actually be required to have intercourse with a stand-in for Ishtar. And so Ishtar would be represented by one of the temple priestesses, and the king would go and pick out the one that he wanted to be Ishtar in human form in order to complete this ritual. Once we start to see the shift from matriarchy to patriarchy, the temples of Ishtar really start to change and they become temples full of prostitutes. But at this point, prostitution does not have the same negative connotation that it does today. Men would come there for fertility and sexual power because they believed that Ishtar would only answer their pleas if they came and visited her cult. And this is, in fact, the first recorded instances we actually have of women selling themselves for sex in these temples in Sumer. And so sex in the temple was really supposed to confer special blessings on both men and women. But that was very different than the form of modern prostitution where they were simply having sex for money. There was certainly a religious element to this, a sacred element, and they believed that they were quite literally communing with the goddess Ishtar when they came to visit members of. All women were required at least once in their lives to go to the Temple of Ishtar and to join her cult, even if it was just for a short period of time. They would sit in the temple until a stranger came and threw a piece of silver in their lap, and then they would leave the temple and have intercourse with the stranger, and afterwards they would return home. Women were not allowed to refuse the first stranger who threw a piece of silver to them. And some rather less attractive women stayed in that temple for years waiting to be thrown a coin. So Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, actually wrote about this custom. He said, quote, "The foulest Babylonian custom is that which compels every woman of the land to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have intercourse with some stranger at least once in her life. Many women who are rich and proud and disdain to mingle with the rest, drive to the temple in covered carriages drawn by teams and stand there with a great retinue of attendants. But most sit down in the sacred plot of Aphrodite, with crowns of cords on their heads. There is a great multitude of women coming and going. Passages marked by line run every way through the crowd, by which the men pass and make their choice. Once a woman has taken her place there, she does not go away to her home before some stranger has cast money into her lap and had intercourse with her outside of the temple. But while he casts the money, he must say, 'I invite you in the name of Mylitta.' That is the Assyrian name for Aphrodite. It does not matter what sum the money is, the woman will never refuse, for that would be a sin, the money being by this act made sacred. So she follows the first man who casts it and rejects no one. After their intercourse, having discharged her sacred duty to the goddess, she goes away to her home, and thereafter there is no bribe, however great, that will get her. So then the women that are fair and tall are soon free to depart, but the uncomely have long to wait because they cannot fulfill the law, for some of them remain for 3 years or 4. There is a custom like this in some parts of Cyprus." Now you can tell from this primary source here that they refer to Ishtar as Aphrodite, and she also takes the name Mylitta. And you might pick up in here that one of the reasons for doing this is that it was considered a sacred symbolic exchange when the money was given to the women, and that when the women had intercourse with these men, it was in fact Ishtar imparting power and fertility to these men. In addition, it was believed that if a woman did this just before or just after marriage, that when she returned home, she would never be able to be defrauded or tricked, and she would always remain faithful to her husband. Now, men and women continued throughout most of Mesopotamian history to pray to Ishtar for virility and fertility and sexual power. And there were laws that were very strictly enforced that made it a serious offense to speak badly of any holy prostitutes. The picture that you see up on the upper left-hand side of the screen is actually one of the temples of Ishtar that is still standing today. It was very common to find phalluses at pretty much every temple and shrine, and in fact, some are even in the shape of a giant phallus. So this one is actually fairly tame in comparison to others. And the picture of the lion here is also because Ishtar was known as the lion goddess. She takes many forms throughout Mesopotamian history. Lastly, when we look at ancient Mesopotamia, some of the very first references to sexually transmitted diseases are found in ancient Babylonia, and this may not surprise you given what you've just learned. And two of the diseases that historians think were actually running rampant were gonorrhea and syphilis, and there was a widespread belief that the gods actually caused these diseases. In Hammurabi's code, he actually warns to anyone that opposes him that, quote, an evil disease, a dangerous sore which cannot be cured, which physicians cannot diagnose, which he cannot allay with bandages, and which, like the bite of death, cannot be removed, and that he, until he brings his life to an end, may lament the loss of his vigor. Curse him, his seed, his land, his army, his people, and his troops, with an evil curse. So what Hammurabi is actually saying here to his enemies is that you don't want to mess with me, because if you do, I'm going to smite you with some syphilis or some gonorrhea. So moving on to ancient Egypt. Sexuality in ancient Egypt was extremely open and untainted by guilt. In Mesopotamia, they often kept sexuality behind closed doors. It certainly was not as visible as it would be in ancient Egypt, where sex was considered an important part of your life from the time that you were born until the time that you died. And even in the afterlife, they believed that sexuality was an important part of your life. So even the Egyptian religion, and in particular the Book of the Dead, is filled with all sorts of tales of adultery, incest, homosexuality, masturbation, and even necrophilia. The pictures that you're seeing here come from a document known as the Turin Erotic Papyrus. You can see parts of it in the picture on the very bottom lower left. And there's a wonderful History Channel documentary on this called Sex in the Ancient World, Ancient Egypt. And in particular, this is a papyrus that was found buried on a scroll in a tomb for one of the nobility of the Old Kingdom. And the reason that they would have buried a papyrus with such erotic and really pornographic elements to it is that they believed that sex continued on in the afterlife, and that the cycle of life and death and rebirth were all intimately connected through sexuality. We also find prostitution in ancient Egypt. In fact, we see the first true brothels in the world that have no real connection to religion in the same way that sacred prostitution did. And prostitutes often advertised through their clothing and their makeup, and they wore a blue faience beaded fishnet dress like the one you see over on the right. It is essentially see-through. And you would have known a woman was a prostitute if she painted her lips a bright red, tattooed her breasts or her thighs, and even if she went around totally nude. And for those of you who are particularly interested in makeup application, learning about makeup in ancient Egypt is really interesting because they were really some of the first pioneers in figuring out how to use lipstick and how to use eyeliner and making perfume. We've still found perfumes that we can still smell in some of the tombs, as well as in making and wearing wigs because they shaved their heads in order to rid themselves of lice. There is also another really interesting History Channel documentary called Scandals of the Ancient World, and one of them in specific is about the Festival of Drunkenness that actually celebrates the salvation of humanity. And you might say that it's an ancient version of sort of Girls Gone Wild meets the Woodstock Music Festival. So the purpose for this particular festival is a religious one, and it's based on the myth of Ra and Hathor. Ra in the Egyptian pantheon is the supreme god, the sun god, and as he grew older, he felt that humans were losing respect for him, and so he gathered all of the demigods together to hear his counsel, and he chose to send the goddess Hathor down to earth to strike fear in the heart of men. Now, this might sound a little familiar to you because the beginning of this actually sounds a great deal like the tale of Noah and the flood. However, it departs from there because he actually orders Hathor to go down and slay people. And Hathor goes down as a mighty lioness named Sekhmet and begins slaying mankind left and right. And once she tastes blood, she cannot be appeased. She goes into a rage and continues to kill more and more men and women and children. At this point, Ra realizes that he doesn't actually want the human race to be destroyed completely, so he figures out a way to trick Hathor into stopping her destructive ways. He asks his attendants to take 7,000 jars of red beer to the location where she had viciously slaughtered the remnants of humankind, and they poured the beer into the fields, and Hathor, thinking it was blood, goes down and drinks this beer. She becomes drunk, she falls asleep, and she abandons her bloodthirsty quest, thereby saving all of humanity through her drinking of the beer. So this annual festival of drunkenness would feature a month-long celebration that involved sex, drugs, and the equivalent of rock and roll for us, very forward music. Everyone would come together as a community and they would get fall down, passed out drunk, and often high on the lotus blossom. There are inscriptions at the Temple of Hatshepsut that link the Festival of Drunkenness to traveling through the marshes, which was a euphemism for the Egyptians for sexuality. And one thing I find really interesting about this is that there were rules that every year certain people were set aside to remain sober and serve as designated drivers for the drunkards. And of course, they weren't driving them in SUVs, but the wealthy would be driven home in chariots. And so they were worried about safety in this regard. And really, this is a 1 month sort of hall pass for men and women to become sexually involved with someone other than their husband and wife. But this is outside of the norm of everyday Egyptian marriage and love. For most families, this is really an exception to the rule because men and women in Egypt cherished marriage and they married and coupled for life. And in particular, outside of this festival, adultery was very extremely harshly punished for women. We know that contraception did exist in ancient Egypt, but it was very rarely used because the point, again, of marriage was procreation. So if it was used by prostitutes. And so the method of contraception they would use is to take crocodile dung and honey and mix them together and insert them into the vagina in order to create a barrier to the cervix to keep the sperm from reaching the egg. Now, you might think, well, first of all, this is just really gross, but secondly, you might wonder how it keeps from giving a woman some kind of infection by putting feces down there. And the answer to that lies in the properties of honey. And we've actually gone and found honey in the tombs of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom nobility, and this honey is still good. You can still eat it. And there are incredible antibiotic and antiseptic properties to honey that would help to ensure that the pH balance was not thrown off and that infection was not particularly an issue. Now, it's almost impossible to talk about sexuality and marriage in Egypt without talking about incest. And incest was not very common in the average family, but it was very common in the nobility, and in particular between half brothers and sisters, and between granddaughters and grandfathers and cousins. And the reason for this, of course, is that despite the fact that pharaohs were almost always men, the power would actually be passed down through the female line. And so you would have to marry into the female line if you wanted to become pharaoh, or if you wanted to become in a position of power or nobility. And in order to have an official marriage, that marriage had to be consummated. Now, the pictures that you see at the bottom of the screen, on the far left is a recreation of what King Tut probably looked like, and then you actually see his mummy. And King Tut, of course, is famous for being just 13 and a pharaoh when he passed away. And what a lot of people don't know about him is that he actually married and had intercourse with his half sister, and also that his mother and father were siblings. And so he was born with a cleft palate and a club foot, and probably that is what caused him to be weak and sickly and to pass away before ever maturing and reaching adulthood. So this idea of being sexually liberal and open, it wasn't just amongst common people, but it also extended into the government. And within their religious system, they believed that masturbation, when performed by an Egyptian god, was considered creative and magical, and that the ebb and flow of the Nile River actually could be attributed to the frequency of Atum's ejaculations, because in Egyptian mythology, Atum, their original supreme god, actually created the world through masturbation. And so Egyptian pharaohs were at one time required to masturbate ceremonially into the Nile River with their viziers or their royal advisors standing there watching to ensure that the task was done. So to us, this probably seems very strange. I mean, if you can even try to imagine our US president being required to ceremonially ejaculate into the Potomac River before taking office in front of his cabinet, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. But we have to kind of keep in mind that this is linked intimately with their religious beliefs, and we have to keep attempting to have a mindset of cultural relativism. So, Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, they were going to have a continuation of life on Earth, but that continuation of life was going to be even better than it ever was while they were on Earth and alive. And so they believed that there would be sex after death. And we have found Egyptian men with false penises attached to their mummies, and Egyptian women with artificial nipples or breasts attached. And they believed that these would actually be fully functional in the afterlife. And we also have found, you'll see over on the right side, some pictures of ancient fertility dolls, which means that they believed that men and women could continue to create offspring in the afterlife. Now, the next quotation you see here is also from the Greek historian Herodotus, and it says, "The wives of men of rank, when they die, are not given at once to be embalmed, nor such women as are very beautiful or of greater regard than others, but on the third or fourth day after their death, and not before, they are delivered to the embalmers. They do so about this matter in order that the embalmers may not abuse their women. For they say that one of them was taken once doing so to the corpse of a woman lately dead, and his fellow craftsman gave information." Now, historians don't know if what Herodotus is saying is 100% true, but according to Herodotus and some other sources, there was an issue with necrophilia in ancient Egypt, and the issue stemmed from religious beliefs that if a young woman died once she had reached a certain age without ever marrying or having sexual intercourse, then she could not move on into the afterlife and be happy. And so there has been some postulating that the parents of this young woman would actually pay somebody to essentially have intercourse after she had already passed away, so that she could move on into the afterlife and have a happy and healthy afterlife. Now, Herodotus here is arguing that because this was happening, they would end up actually waiting to embalm the young women and allow them to decay a bit before doing so, in order to uh, sort of decrease the likelihood of this happening. Okay, so we have two more civilizations to look at, and the next one is the Indus River Valley. And most of the ancient texts of the Indus River Valley, the Vedas, for example, reveal all kinds of moral prescriptions about sex and marriage and fertility and love. And sex here was considered a mutual duty between a married couple and husband and wife, and they were supposed to pleasure one another equally. So the 64 arts of love, passion, and pleasure were first written in ancient Sanskrit and then translated into many other languages. And they simply go through a list of all of the ways to please your spouse, and also to keep them in love with you and to make someone fall in love with you. Probably the most well-known of these writings is the Kama Sutra. You can still, of course, buy it in your average bookstore. It was compiled by Vatsyayana from a lot of different authors in the 3rd century, so it wasn't just one person who wrote the Kama Sutra. And he claimed that he was a celibate monk and that he was compiling all the sexual knowledge of the ages past to form a meditation and contemplation of the deity. And he wrote this in a very complex form of Sanskrit that has only recently been translated. The link that you see at the bottom of the page here actually takes you to a free text document of all the different parts of the Kama Sutra, so that you can read it in its original primary source documentation. It's got some very interesting parts. Now, they believed that in this Kama Sutra, it says that in order for marriages to be happy, both men and women should be well versed in the arts of pleasure, both carnal and cerebral, which means that they should not just understand sexuality, but they should also understand how to keep their partner happy intellectually. And so some of the topics that it talks about are society and social concepts on sexual unions, how to acquire a wife, about a wife, about the wives of other men, about courtesans, and on the means of attracting others to yourself. So how to make somebody fall in love with you. The book has detailed advice on what a man must do to win over a woman, what a woman must do to win over a man, the state of a woman's mind, so what women are thinking, the role of a go-between, and the reasons why women might reject the advances of men. So clearly it wasn't just a book of sexual positions, as some people might believe, but it was a book about relationships and love and marriage and life, and how to be happy with another person. The Kama Sutra is actually filled with incredibly advanced ideas about aids for sex, and it discusses several different types of apparatuses that could be used in sexual intercourse that other civilizations would later build upon. And one of these is the discussion of sex aids that were made of wood, rubber, gold, silver, copper, ivory, or even animal horn, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable. They advocated also using a tube that was open on both ends and creating the world's first prosthetic penis attachment that would fit over a man's genitals and into a woman's vagina and would be tied at the man's waist. They used actually the dried out eyelashes of goats that were still attached to the eyelid in order to create a sex aid for the male organ. And then the Kama Sutra even discusses the idea that if men do not have a sexual partner, that they should satisfy themselves with dolls. And so you can see that clearly the concept of sexuality in the Kama Sutra is not just about sex between man and wife, but is also about pleasure. So, the Kama Sutra actually incorporates instructions on a variety of ways to touch a lover's body, and these include embracing and kissing and scratching, biting, oral sex, and sexual intercourse. And it instructs specifically, there's an entire chapter about extramarital affairs and how to basically steal away the wife of another man. It devotes pages to the seduction methods that are practiced by courtesans, and the final chapter, in case all else fails, contains all kinds of recipes for tonics and powders and foods that have the power to help attract others to oneself. And some of these, by today's standards, are just a little strange and would probably make you laugh. I remember reading one that talked about taking monkey poop and throwing it at the woman in order to make her fall in love with you as a love potion. One aspect of the Kama Sutra that scholars have really focused on is the section on penis enlargement and modification because it's so advanced for the time period in which it was written. And some of the tips that were offered for making the male organ bigger was to rub wasp stingers or insects that lived in the trees that would sting or bite on it, to rub it with bristles from plants and oils, or to, of course, use the prosthetic penis attachments that we discussed earlier. And in this particular section of the Kama Sutra, they call for piercing the lingam, which is simply another word for the male penis, like the lobes of the ear of an infant. And the way that they do this is that they take a sharp instrument and they stand in the water so that their blood will continue to flow, and they pierce the lingam. And then afterwards, the individual is instructed to continue having sex with their partner each night in order to keep the piercing clean. And then each day they will increase the size by putting a small piece of cane in it to gradually enlarge the orifice. Now, the monuments that you see on the right-hand side of this screen and on the next several screens are actually the Khajuraho group of monuments, and they are probably one of the most popular tourist destinations in all of India. They were built in the Middle Ages. However, they show this very liberal attitude within which sex has been viewed in early Indian culture, because the sculptures on it are extremely erotic. They were built by monarchs between about 950 and 1150 of the Common Era, and this is when the tantric tradition was just beginning to be in vogue. The temple is made out of sandstone, and the builders used mortise and tenon joints, held together by gravity rather than just mortar. All right, so the last civilization we're going to talk about is ancient China. And one of the ways that scholars have actually learned about ancient Chinese sexuality is by looking at Chinese literature and taking the metaphorical imagery in order to understand their lives. And so whenever you see clouds mentioned in the literature, it's referring to a woman's ova or vaginal secretions. And when they often speak about rain, it's referring to a male semen. Now, we see a form of very strict patriarchy in China, especially when Confucianism takes hold, because they see women as innately weak and in a position of inferiority and submission to their husbands and their fathers. And some dynasties are more strict than others. Dynasties in which Taoism is incredibly popular are not going to be very strict. But in every single one of them, they really rigidly enforce virginity through community and family policing. And they believe in actually giving a monetary value through a bride price when women marry men. And while women were supposed to control themselves before marriage and during marriage, men, again, were allowed to have sexual trysts and even have concubines, which of course represents that double sexual standard that we were talking about earlier. So the way that they would choose their marriage partner is that the first wife of a man would usually be chosen by the father or the grandfather, and oftentimes they would go to see a matchmaker in order to learn about what woman or man was available within their village or nearby who was of the same social class, and who seemed like they would make a good partner. Now, once their father or grandfather had actually chosen the first wife of a man, then later on he could go and pick a more desirable sexual partner, and that partner would be called a concubine. And then he also could have his servants be sexually available to him as well. So during the Shu dynasty, we see a surgence of Taoist philosophy, and the symbol that you see over on the right side is the symbol of the yin and the yang. I'm sure you've seen it before, and it really represents a great deal of things, but one of the things it represents is the difference between men and women. And the Chinese believed that women had this inexhaustible supply of yin essence, and that men had a very limited supply of yang essence. So it was forbidden for men to use up their yang essence without acquiring yin essence. Before a man was allowed to ejaculate, he had to prolong it and make the woman orgasm several times to acquire her yin essence. They believed essentially that if a man actually ran out of his yang essence, he would get sick and he could even die from this. And this is why you see in many of the ancient Chinese texts that masturbation was forbidden for men, but it was allowed for women, as long as they didn't use foreign objects that could injure their womb, because again, procreation was still the sole purpose of marriage. Upon marrying, you would find a Chinese man would present a scroll to his bride on their wedding night, and the scroll would contain 9 primary sexual positions, and 30 positions would also be commonly practiced, and some of those actually involved more than one female partner, so they were incredibly liberal with sexuality in the bedroom. And in fact, we get the idea of the missionary position from ancient China, while we get the word missionary position from early Christian missionaries in the New World. We actually get the position because Taoists believe that men were born to lie face down and women were born to lie on their back face up. And they believed this because men typically drowned face up, or drowned face down, and women drowned face up. Now, when it came to oral sex, it was considered okay as long as it was being done to a female, because it would increase her yin essence, which then the male would be able to acquire some of. But you never wanted to perform this on a man to the point of ejaculation, because you would be seen as actually making him sick by weakening his energy. At this point, female homosexuality was actually quite widespread, but male homosexuality was very rare because, of course, they believed that they would be continually losing their yang essence without ever gaining any yin essence. Now, eventually, when we move into the Middle Ages to the Han Dynasty, we'll start to see male homosexuality figures reaching those that are seen in other societies, but in ancient China, it was something that men were often afraid of. Now, prostitution is also seen in ancient China, and it was originally acceptable because the men thought that these women would have even more yin than a regular woman would. So they believed that because these women had sex with so many men, they could acquire yang essence in them, and they would have some to spare. So they could give a patron more essence, really, than he lost in having sex. But eventually, Chinese medicine started to identify that prostitutes carried sexually transmitted diseases, and they began to warn men against this practice of going and visiting prostitutes. So as time goes on and they shift from Taoism to Confucianism, you see women are placed in a much inferior position to men. And the pictures you're seeing on this slide here are actually of women whose feet have been bound. And it was considered incredibly appealing, beauty-wise and sexually, to have tiny little, 3 or 4 inch lotus feet. And the way that they would do this is, starting at a young age of 6 or 7, they would literally break a girl's feet, and they would bind her feet with her toes tucked underneath so that her foot would grow this way. And the end result would be that women were unable to run away at all, and many of them were unable to stand and work for long periods of time. So it completely subjugated women to men. During the Qin dynasty, when Confucianism became the major religious view, any kind of physical contact between men and women was confined to marriage and to the bedroom or to a couch, but it was a private act, and sex itself was seen as a sin by Confucius. It was viewed as something that you should only do for procreation, and it was sacred and part of family life. Now, men were still allowed to have concubines, of course, and there was an entire set of rules under Confucianism for concubines. Men had a sacred duty to have regular sex with their wives and concubines at least once every 5 days, which sounds incredibly exhausting. So, luckily for them, according to these rules, men could then retire from their sexual obligations at the age of 60. But once they hit the age of 70, they began to have sex once again. So they only got a break for about 10 years. All of the emperors would have had concubines, and in some cases they would have had entire harems at their disposal. And the people that they chose to guard these concubines were eunuchs. And eunuchs, you will see throughout the course, become incredibly important in Chinese history, but they're also evident in Indian history and also even in the Christian church in early Europe. And what a eunuch is a castrated male. And in some cases, these were prisoners who were castrated against their will. In other cases, these were people who volunteered to be castrated because eunuchs were afforded a great deal of power, prestige, and respect in society. And in still other cases, families sent their children to be made eunuchs against the child's will. They had no choice because their families sought power and notoriety within the empire. And the reason that these eunuchs would be chosen to actually guard the harem is because the emperor knew he could trust them not to touch any of his women. And so the emperor was supposed to set an example for all men. He was supposed to be sort of the manly man, the uber man, and to absorb the yin essence from the orgasmic fluid of the 81 nymphs and 27 concubines that he must have in order to strengthen his yang. And then frequently, emperors also had 9 wives whom they had to worry about impregnating. So this last slide that you see here actually has several primary source documents listed. The first is about that piece of Mesopotamian pottery. The second is one of the more interesting chapters of the Kama Sutra. The third is a museum exhibit from the British Museum on same-sex desire in the ancient world. And the fourth is actually about the Epic of Gilgamesh and analyzing whether or not it's the first gay love story in the world. And why I think it's particularly important for students to read primary sources is that your teachers, your history teachers, could essentially tell you anything. But the only way for you to really know the true story and to know whether or not you believe what they're saying is to go back and read the sources of people who actually lived through these events. And so we've covered a lot of material in the last couple of minutes, and we've probably talked about a lot of things that you may never have heard of before and that seem a little bit startling. But what I kind of want you to keep in mind is that despite the fact that this might seem very different, in a lot of ways, our own society is incredibly sexually liberal as well. Now, we certainly don't, have sex in the same room with our children, and we don't necessarily all follow the Kama Sutra or make love potions or have concubines. But prostitution is still a huge problem in our world. Sex trafficking is still a big problem. We still see sex outside of marriage. Divorce rates are they're over 50% now. Extramarital sex is still an issue. Polyamorous relationships are actually on the rise. And so certainly there are some similarities that we're going to see between sex in the ancient world and sex today.